All right. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for yet another Northeast Cover Crop Council short webinar. I'm Victoria Ackroyd. I'm the program manager for the Northeast Cover Crops Council. My co-host is Susan Brulette with the University of Vermont Extension. Today's session qualifies for, it's not crop management CCACEUs today, it's weeds, right, Susan? It'll be 0.5 credits. We'll put the slide up that you need at the end with the QR code and the information to get credit for attending. As always, this talk will be about 20 minutes long. There will be about 10 minutes at the end for questions. You are absolutely welcome to throw questions into the chat as they occur to you. And you're also very much welcome to speak up at the end. If you need the captions, see the information that Emily has kindly added to the chat about how to access that. This webinar is being recorded and will be available along with the slides on the University of Vermont Extension website pretty quick after this talk. So with all that out of the way, today's speaker is Mark VanGessel. Mark is a professor and extension specialist at the University of Delaware and an NECCC board member. His program focuses on developing and disseminating weed control recommendations and other technical information appropriate to agronomic and commercial vegetable systems. Technical information emphasizes weed biology and ecology. His research efforts fall into 5 main areas: weed biology and ecology, integrated pest management, cover crops for weed management, herbicide-resistant weeds, and herbicide evaluation. Research is focused on agronomic and commercial vegetable crops important to the Mid-Atlantic region. Mark, thank you for speaking today. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Victoria. All right, we'll get started here then. All right. All right. Good deal. Well, thank you. I was asked if I would talk about the topic of cover crops and herbicide issues related to cover crops. So that is the topics that I'm going to focus on, kind of setting the stage of why this is an important topic, something that we need to consider. Talk about herbicide carryover and disposition and breakdown in the soil, and then just a few herbicide reminders, particularly when a cover crop is used for something other than straight ecological services. So most of my research and extension program related to cover crops really focuses on weed control. In the Mid-Atlantic region, as well as other parts of the U.S., herbicide-resistant weeds are a serious issue, and we're looking for effective strategies that we can incorporate into our cropping practices that will help us with weed management. And cover crops certainly play a key role in that, is what we have found over the years. The influence of cover crops on weeds, we end up with fewer weeds. The number of weeds that emerge is reduced in the presence of a cover crop, and then those weeds that do emerge grow slower. They take longer to attain a height of, say, 4 to 5 inches. What that means is that it provides the farmers a little bit wider window of when they need to get into that field and manage that weed before it gets too large for effective control. So the cover crop helps to slow that growth. Cover crops don't directly impact the weeds per se. That's done through primarily competition and physical suppression of weeds. Unlike maybe a mechanical weed control of tillage or a herbicide that directly impacts the weed itself, this is done more through competition. And so particularly with our winter annual weeds that are emerging in the late summer and fall, even up into early spring, most of that occurs, the influence that the cover crop has on those weeds is primarily competition, competing for resources of light, moisture, nutrients, and space. Um, when we terminate that cover crop, that is one time when we do have a direct impact on those weeds. And depending on our method of terminating the cover crop, it can, like a herbicide application or heavy mechanical tillage, we can have a direct impact on that weed. Roller crimping, some of these other methods aren't as effective on terminating it, but of the weeds, but it is a direct impact on the weeds. And then once that cover crop is dead, uh, the cover crop serves as a physical suppression to suppress weeds, keeping weeds from, again, preventing light and modifying soil temperature to modify how much um, growth we're getting out of those weeds. But not going to bore you with a whole lot of data, but as an extension specialist and professor, I feel like I got to throw in a couple of bar charts. But what I just want to make the point that we have seen that as amount of biomass increases, the effect on weeds also increases. So we see that both with winter annual weeds as well as summer annual weeds. In this particular trial, we modified the timing of termination, which then influenced how much biomass was present at planting. And in both cases, both winter annuals and summer annuals, we saw a pretty drastic reduction in the number of weeds because of cover crop. So it's important that we get good establishment of cover crop. We get a good amount of biomass that's produced, and our cover crop biomass is going to be influenced by a number of factors. And we've heard others talk about this in these webinars, but inherent soil fertility or residual soil fertility at time of planting, seeding rate of our cover crops, planting date of our cover crops, the environmental conditions, termination dates, all have an impact on how much biomass production is there. And one thing that we often don't think about is herbicide carryover as well. Herbicides that have the potential to reduce the growth of the cover crop, or at least part of the cover crop mixtures, less biomass, less ecological services that might be providing, particularly as it relates to weed control and weed suppression. So we need to examine the nuances in management of that cover crop if we're looking to maximize the benefits of cover crops. Weed control benefits involves many factors. Many things come into play, again, because cover crops don't have a direct impact on the weeds. We're trying to increase the biomass to allow for that cover crop to provide more competition, or more biomass is going to serve as physical suppression later in the season. So having a range of cover crops on the soil, again, more cover crop tends to get improved weed control. So the herbicides that we might have used previously in the year are still all present in the soil at time of application. Herbicides are going to break down through a number of different processes. The main processes that occurs is microbial decomposition, meaning that herbicide molecule is in the soil. The microbes use that as a feed source and break down the herbicides into a compound that has no more herbicidal properties. Chemicals may break. We may have chemical composition that occurs in the soil as well. Again, rendering that to a non-herbicidal properties. Herbicides may bind to the soil, so they're tightly bound to the soil, not being available to plants for uptake is one method of loss. Plant uptake, once that weed or crop takes up the herbicide and incorporates it inside the plant, again, herbicide is no longer available in the soil. And last one I have on my list is just herbicide movement. Whether that herbicide moves down through the soil and particularly out of the seed zone, making it no longer available for the cover, in this case, the cover crop to take up and potentially damage that cover crop. There are other ways that herbicides are lost. There's some photo decomposition that might occur. There's some volatilization, and so there's a number of different factors that can all impact how these herbicides are broken down. The decomposition of herbicides will vary often from chemical to chemical. There's no one set method of herbicide loss that's uniformly effective across all chemicals. So it's chemical specific as well. Some of the other things that come into play is which herbicide was used. As I just mentioned, not all herbicides break down similarly. Not all of them break down at the same speed or the same rate. Some herbicides may remain viable in the soil for only a few weeks, while others may take months to fully break down. The rate of the herbicide impacts how much or the potential for carryover as well. And time of application, and we're going to get into this a little bit more, but when is that herbicide applied? Is it applied during a time when the microbes are active to use as a food source, particularly for those microbes or those chemicals that are broken down microbially? Soil variables that can impact herbicide breakdown. Soil pH, for one, is one that can alter the speed and how quickly things break down. Soil type and soil organic matter. Is that soil matrix conducive for soil adsorption and not making it available for breakdown? Weather, particularly since many of our herbicides are broken down microbially, the having adequate soil moisture and adequate soil temperatures to maximize microbial activity influences how long that herbicide remains viable in the soil. Just some of the variables, soil variables in particular, I mentioned these, medium textured and fine textured soils, particularly with organic matter above 3%, increase the risk for herbicide carryover. Reason for that is there's more herbicide that's bound to that soil that then can desorb, move off the soil particles later in the year. So the more that's absorbed, meaning then there's more likelihood that it can come off the soil matrix later and potentially injure the cover crop. Some herbicides, in particular the triazines and the sulfonylureas, can be influenced by soil pH. Particularly higher pHs, they increase the risk of carryover. They just don't break down quite as rapidly in these higher pH soils. So these are just some of the soil variables that come into play that can impact herbicide decomposition. Just providing a few kind of visuals on herbicides and from a more practical standpoint, how they might impact our cover crop planting. This is a generic broadleaf crop with our pre-emergence herbicide applied at planting. Oftentimes what we're looking for is that herbicide to remain biologically active long enough into the season that then the crop canopy forms. We have a nice crop canopy that shades the rows, prevents the further emergence of weeds and slows down the growth of the weeds that are underneath that canopy. This is kind of an ideal scenario where the herbicide lasts long enough that we get to that canopy closure, but not so long that it's still present later in the year, late in the year. Not all herbicides have those properties, though. Herbicide B, for instance, while we may use it at a higher rate, it just doesn't last as long. So knowing which of the herbicides that we're using and the potential for carryover is really important. From a practical standpoint, if we're using herbicide B and it doesn't carry us long enough into the season, we may have to use a post-emergence herbicide to prevent weeds, limit weed growth until we have that crop canopy developed. Yeah, that post-emergence herbicide could be herbicide C in this case, which has no residual activity. So once it's applied, it kills weeds that it comes in contact with, but later emerging weeds and later emerging cover crops, it's not going to have much effect on. However, we also may use, say, like a herbicide D, which has post-emergence activity, but also has that residual as well. So controls the weeds that are there at time of application, then may provide another 2 to 4 weeks of residual beyond that. So knowing the herbicide properties that we're using really can help us select which herbicides are potential for impacting cover crop growth in the fall. Cover crop breakdown is it occurs over time, and one of the things that this really comes into play is when we think about planting cover crops. I think initially, folks thought of cover crop as being something that's planted after the cash crop is harvested. In this case, in the fall. But there's been a lot of work looking at getting that cover crop established earlier and earlier, whether we look at interseeding, like with the picture to the left, which is then, interseeded at about the maybe 5-6 weeks after planting. So very little time for that herbicide to break down. Or even going in and a standing corn crop like we have at the top right at the top with an air seeder. That's often in our region going in being used in early August. So 4 to 5 weeks before that corn is often harvested. So that's less time for that herbicide to break down. Or the more traditional on the bottom right, where cover crop is drilled or seeded after that cash crop is harvested. That's oftentimes our longest time between herbicide application and planting. So these are all factors that we need to consider when we think about the likelihood of herbicide carryover in our particular field. The other factor that comes into play is how sensitive is that cover crop to the particular herbicide. So in many cases, we might be using a herbicide that is very safe on the cover crops, and regardless of that time that we use between application and seeding, is really is not a major factor. Other herbicides may be highly, or the other way around, the cover crop is highly sensitive to some of these cover crops. These cover crops are highly sensitive to the herbicide, and even little amount of residue of that herbicide in the soil could damage these cover crops. So some of the scenarios like this, atrazine for one, the clovers and the radishes are quite sensitive to atrazine. Whereas our winter grains tend to be the most tolerant of these cover crops to atrazine. Some of the others, Mesotrione, the active ingredient in Callisto, or it's also one of the major components in Halix GT, a commonly used post-emergence herbicide. We find that clovers and radishes, the legumes, are quite sensitive to mesotrione and can cause injury, even prevent stand establishment, whereas the grasses are very tolerant to mesotrione. And then chlorimeron, similarly, the legumes, the brassicas tend to be quite sensitive to small residues of chlorimeron in the soil, whereas grasses are quite tolerant of it. So need to think about not only what herbicides were used, but also what cover crop we might be planting to match it up to minimize the impact of herbicide carryover. Here's a chart that was put together by University of Missouri. They did some excellent work a few years ago looking at a range of herbicides and their sensitivity or the sensitivity of cover crops to these herbicides. And this just kind of illustrates the type of experience or type of activity we can see as far as potential carryover. So here we have forage radish. In the upper left is the non-treated plot. The first picture to the right is Flexstar with fomosafen, and you can see it really damage the radishes. The radishes are quite sensitive to that. On the other hand, if you move one square down, right dead in the center there is First Rate, a herbicide where the very good establishment of forage radish. So again, illustrates the importance of knowing, matching up the herbicides that were used and the potential that it could have for the cover crop that's being planted. I'm going to put in the chat a link to this to this publication that from University of Missouri for a resource. This information is pretty dense, information dense, a little bit hard to put together in a short webinar like this, but this will be an excellent resource for people who are trying to match up their herbicides and potential cover crops. Being about as far south in the Northeast region as you can get, we have very different scenarios maybe than the folks in Vermont and the New England states. Longer growing season, coarser textured soils. So we have a environment that's more favorable for herbicide breakdown. So these are just some of the general guidelines that I provide for our producers who are looking at using cover crops and have questions about is there potential for carryover. Under less than ideal conditions, and I say that since a lot of our fields are irrigated, so we don't have moisture limitation. This year, on the other hand, we certainly did, and this is the type of year where potential for carryover is greater. But with our corn herbicides, using atrazine or simazine, usually less than a pound, we can plant cereal rye and generally do not see a problem with establishment of cereal rye. If atrazine or simazine was used at a lower rate, particularly less than 3/4 of a pound, we can often get away with planting most of our legumes and mustards without seeing any effect on the cover crop. Mesotrione, again, I mentioned that is one that's commonly used for post-emergence in corn, can be problematic for legumes and mustards under dry conditions. And a list of soybean herbicides with Classic and Pursuit fomosafen can be a problem for fall-seeded legumes and mustards. However, we generally don't see an issue with cereal grains planting after these cover crops, these herbicides. So carryover can range from a minimal amount of injury, maybe a little discoloration of the leaves, all the way up to complete plant depth. So knowing which cover crops you want to plant, which herbicides you were using, and matching it up so you don't set yourself up for failure in terms of getting a good establishment of that cover crop. Injury of a cover crop can reduce vigor and early season biomass. In some cases, the cover crop may compensate, and by termination in the spring, biomass is up to an untreated area. But it's, again, knowing the risk of cover crop injury with specific herbicides is important. I wanted to touch on this other topic of herbicide rotations, when that cover crop might be used for something other than strictly ecological services. If that cover crop is grazed or harvested, then we need to treat that as a cash crop, if you will, and follow the pesticide labels on what is the rotation for between time of applying those herbicides and planting the cover crop. And it varies widely from herbicide to herbicide. Here's just a couple of examples. The Bicep 2 label says that a treated crop, it cannot be grazed or fed if it's planted after the cash crop was harvested. Zidua, herbicide that's becoming more popular in our area, we can plant or any small grains other than wheat. It's 11-month rotation to planting that crop. Halix GT, I've mentioned that a couple of times. It's going to be 4.5 months to rye. So if Halix GT is sprayed on June 1, that cover crop can't be planted until October 15th, and if it's going to be grazed or harvested. So it's difficult to make generalities on what are these rotational intervals. You need to go back to the product that was used and follow it if that crop is going to be harvested or if it's going to be used as a foraged or grazed. So potential damage from herbicide carryover varies by a number of factors. The likelihood increases as we move further north because of less time for herbicide breakdown. Herbicide injury may be acceptable for some farmers depending on what their situation is. But if the crop is going to be harvested or grazed, we need to follow the herbicide rotational restrictions. So that I want to recognize a few people who I've borrowed slides from over the years: Bill Curran and John Wallace at Penn State, and Kevin Bradley at University of Missouri. And I'll put that URL in the chat. You go back to Kevin's talk and look more specifically at a fuller range of herbicides and cover crop species. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk, Mark. Wow, very complex topic. I'm sitting here listening to you and thinking these tools that we're developing, this one is ripe for a tool as well. In the meantime, I guess we'll have to settle for those PDFs. So we are almost at the half hour, and so I am going to go on ahead and say that first off, Susan, have you got that slide for the CCA CEUs? There we go. You rock. Thank you. If you need to put in for the CEU, please go on ahead and follow the directions that you now see on your screen. Anyone who has any questions is welcome to either email me and I'll pass it along to Mark, or Mark is at University of Delaware. You can look him up and email him yourself. The recording and the PDF will be available as soon as we get to it on University of Extension. Wow, and it's already Wednesday. University of Vermont Extension website. I threw the URL in the chat as we get to it. So thank you for attending today. I hope to see you guys again next Wednesday. And Mark, thanks for another great talk.
Thank you.